Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Chialaska webinar, which is titled Plastics, Chemicals, and Cancer, the Role of the Global Plastics Treaty in Preventing Breast Cancer. My name is Sarah. I'm the Communications Coordinator with Alaska Community Action on Toxics, or ACAT. And Chialaska is a program of ACAT and Collaborative for Health and Environment, and it's also part of CHE's broader international coalition of over 5,000 individuals across the globe. For today's webinar, we will leave some time at the end for audience questions. So feel free to send in your questions using the Q&A box feature at the bottom of your screen. And you'll be able to send in your questions at any point throughout the webinar. So feel free to send them in early. And I'll jump right in and introduce our speakers today. We have Dr. Jennifer Kay, who is a research scientist at Silent Spring Institute studying chemical breast cancer risk factors. And we have Rashmi Shakti, who is a research associate at Silent Spring Institute, where they apply their computational expertise to study how chemicals contribute to rising breast cancer rates. So thank you so much to our speakers for joining us today. And now I'll hand it over to you, Jenny, to get us started.
Great, thank you so much. I'll let Rashmi bring up our slides. Great. So thank you to Sarah for inviting us to present today, and to all of you for being here for our presentation. My name is Jenny Kay. I'm here with my colleague Rashmi Shakti from Silent Spring Institute. And we are going to tell you about some work that we've been doing recently, identifying potential breast carcinogens, and specifically breast carcinogens that are found in plastics. The United Nations is currently working on a global treaty to reduce plastics pollution, and we want to discuss how a strong treaty can also help to address the public health crisis that is breast cancer in the US and worldwide. So we can advance to the next slide. Before we get into the sort of science of our presentation, I wanted to just start by introducing Silent Spring Institute, in case you're not familiar. We are a nonprofit research organization located in the Boston area. And we were founded by advocates living on Cape Cod who were concerned about high rates of breast cancer in their community. So they formed the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition in 1994, they founded Silent Spring Institute to create an organization that is really dedicated to understanding and preventing chemical exposures that increase breast cancer risk. Now, since we were founded, our research has expanded beyond breast cancer to other types of chemicals and other diseases. But Rashmi and I are mainly focused on chemicals that increase breast cancer risk. Click. So the reason we are focused on breast cancer is because breast cancer is really a public health crisis. Breast cancer has become the most common cancer diagnosis in the world and in the US. And in addition to being the most common breast cancer, or being the most common cancer diagnosis, it is by far the most common cancer diagnosis among people who are under age 50 and for people who are under age 40. So breast cancer screening usually starts around age 40. But so rising rates of breast cancer in people who are too young to begin mammogram screening cannot be attributed to higher rates of early detection. These rising rates also cannot be attributed to changes in the genetic pool. So we think that there is a good chance that our changing landscape of chemical exposures is playing a role in the rising rates of breast cancer. Click.
Thank you, Jenny, for that intro. I'm Rashmi, and I'm going to take over to explain a little bit about why we're so concerned about plastics specifically. Plastics leak into the environment at every step of their life cycle. So let's take a look at that. If we start on the upper left of this graphic with raw material feedstock, that just refers to the initial chemicals that are added to make plastics. They're then produced into specific kinds of plastics, like the kind that might go into a Ziploc bag or the kind that might instead make up a water bottle. Then different companies buy those types of plastics and turn them into those specific products, which then go on shop shelves and might be bought by people like me or you to then use. As these products reach the end of their lifespan, they might be reused or repaired, but most likely they will get thrown out, where they will be taken to a landfill and sit in the landfill for a while, or they might be recycled, where they are broken back down and then re-enter this process. At every step, there's different plastic chemicals incorporated, either as the initial materials or as additives or processing aids, such as plasticizers that make plastic more bendy and easier to handle. So chemicals are also leaching out of plastics at each of these different steps. For example, styrene is a chemical that you might encounter leaking into the environment at any of these steps. It's particularly important to plastic production. And the point here is that while recycling might be helping with the size of landfills, it's actually giving plastics another chance to leak into the environment and repeat this process. Recycling can also specifically introduce new chemicals that aren't added on purpose. These just might be contaminants that exist in the recycling facility. For example, there is some evidence that atrazine has been found in recycled plastics. So I should also mention that plastic production is increasing exponentially. And as Jenny mentioned, breast cancer is continuing to increase as well. But before we can move to really talking about breast cancer, we should look at the specific context of why plastics have become so important right now. And I'm going to do that by sharing with you 3 different headlines. The first one is this one from the Washington Post talking about how our brains have been filling with microplastics. So that's concerning, and that's because as the environment continues to accumulate more plastics, so do our bodies. Then you may have heard that Los Angeles has had some fire issues lately, and as the Atlantic helpfully points out, that is also a city that contains a lot of plastic, and much of what is burning is plastic material, and that is another way that plastics are able to enter the environment. Then finally, there was this Science Direct article about flame retardants in household items. And this is the one that had a lot of people throwing away their black plastic spatulas, because the ways that we are exposed to these chemicals is often through things that we own and buy. So in summary, plastic production is continuing to increase exponentially, and so plastic chemicals in the environment and in our bodies is going to increase as well. Now that we've seen all these issues coming up, it's time to ask for regulation around plastic. We want our breast cancer science to influence plastic regulation, and the UN Plastics Conference seems like a good way to do this. Between 2022 and the end of 2024, there have been 5 different meetings where they're trying to create an international, actionable, and legally binding treaty. We actually wrote this paper because the final session, session 5 at the tail end of 2024, was happening, and we thought that maybe we would want to bring our potential breast carcinogens list to their attention. Unfortunately, this actually is not the final session because they have failed to agree on a specific treaty. And there's a couple reasons that this didn't work out, but the ones I want to bring up are just that, one, there's some oil states that are not a fan of having capped production. And then also the US specifically went through a policy reversal where it went from supporting caps on plastic production to no longer doing so, to the dismay of many advocates. But even though this has happened, I do want to bring up this quote from the Panama delegation had. "Every day of delay is a day against humanity. Postponing negotiations does not postpone the crisis. We still are going to be living with these problems, even if the regulation hasn't caught up. So it's important to understand the science and still push for things to happen." So now that you have some context about plastics and breast cancer, we can put those 2 things together. The subject of this talk is potential breast carcinogens in plastics. To get there, we combine 2 different lists. The first one on the left here is Silent Spring's breast cancer chemicals list. This is a paper that Jenny actually published and headed in 2024. It takes into account key characteristics, frameworks, and biological data to identify potential breast carcinogens that we're the most worried about. Then we are also looking at the PlastChem database, which is a database of 16,000 chemicals that are found in plastics for various different reasons, either as additives or as perhaps contaminants or as the initial product, anything like that. And it also pulls in specific regulation data about those plastics and as well as their hazard classifications. We're going to focus on the intersection of these two lists in this talk, but first I'll hand it back over to Jenny to explain the breast cancer chemicals list.
Thanks, Rashmi. So some people who are fans of CHE webinars may have actually heard me discuss this list of potential breast carcinogens before, so I'm going to give you a bit of a recap for people who've seen this and a brief introduction for those of you who haven't. So the paper that we published in January last year used a variety of publicly available data sets to identify potential breast carcinogens based on different types of data. And click. So combining these different types of data sources, we were able to identify more than 900 chemicals that we think could be potential breast cancer risk factors. And this got a fair amount of media attention, particularly from environmental health outlets, noting that many of these chemicals are found in consumer products, many of which, of course, contain plastics. Click. So we went about building this list of potential breast carcinogens by stepping back and thinking about what we know about where breast cancer comes from and how chemicals cause breast cancer. So one thing that many chemicals do to cause many types of cancer is to damage DNA, because this can cause mutations and tissue damage that allow for tumors to develop. Click. We also know that breast cancer is strongly modulated by hormonal activity, with increased estrogen and progesterone signaling increasing breast cancer risk. So we know that increased estrogen and progesterone are known to increase breast cancer risk from epidemiological studies, for example, showing that estrogen plus progesterone hormone replacement therapy increased breast cancer risk among postmenopausal women. And these hormones cause breast cells to divide, and too much hormone signaling can overstimulate cell division. Uncontrolled cell division is one of the defining characteristics of cancer. So one way that a chemical can increase estrogen signaling is by activating the estrogen receptor directly. We know that estrogen receptor activation is important for breast cancer because, for one thing, chemicals that have been identified as human breast carcinogens can act as estrogen receptor activators. We also know that estrogen receptor activation is important for breast cancer because many treatments that work to prevent or reduce breast cancer act by blocking the estrogen receptor. So chemicals that activate the estrogen receptor are likely able to increase breast cancer risk. Click. Another way that chemicals can increase estrogen or progesterone signaling is by causing cells within our bodies to produce more of those hormones. Again, we have evidence that chemicals that cause our cells to produce more estrogen or progesterone could be potential breast carcinogens because, again, other breast cancer treatments can work to reduce breast cancer by blocking estrogen or estrogen production. Now, we were able to use assays that have been performed on thousands of chemicals that look at the ability for chemicals to activate the estrogen receptor or stimulate hormone production. Unfortunately, there are no good assays that have been performed on a large number of chemicals that looked for activity at the progesterone receptor, so we weren't able to include that in this particular study. Click. So to build our list of breast cancer relevant chemicals, we first started by building our list from chemicals that have been shown to induce mammary tumors in rodents, because chemicals that can cause these types of tumors in rodents have a decent chance of have a decent basis for extrapolation to breast cancer risk in humans. Furthermore, most chemicals that have been shown to increase breast cancer risk in humans are also able to induce mammary tumors in rodents. Um, Now, not that many chemicals have been tested for their ability to cause cancer, which is why we then turned to cell-based assays that look for the types of endocrine disrupting activities that are known to be associated with breast cancer risk. So we looked at EPA chemical screening that has been performed on about 2,000 chemicals, testing chemicals for their ability to cause cells to produce more estrogen or progesterone, and other assays that look for chemicals' ability to activate the estrogen receptor. So combining these rodent mammary carcinogens with these endocrine disrupting chemicals, we identified 920 chemicals plus ionizing radiation that we consider to be breast cancer relevant exposures. And many of these chemicals have more than one of these activities. Click. Now, since DNA damage is another important way that chemicals can increase cancer risk, we also looked for evidence for each of these 920 chemicals for evidence that they are able to damage DNA, drawing again from more databases from US and international agencies. Click. So a couple highlights of chemicals on this list includes chemicals that are able to do all four of the things shown on this slide, chemicals that cause cells to produce more hormones, activate the estrogen receptor, damage DNA, and cause mammary tumors in rodents. These include things like azo dyes, which are found in plastics, as well as the drug diethylstilbestrol, which was discontinued actually because in part of its association with increased breast cancer risk in humans. We also have chemicals that are able to stimulate hormone production, damage DNA, and cause mammary tumors in rodents, including polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, certain types of pesticides, and other types of dyes, as well as well-known endocrine disruptors like phthalates, bisphenols, and parabens, all of which are also found in plastics. Click. So in our study, we wanted to demonstrate that these forms of endocrine disruption and DNA damaging activities are indeed evidence that a chemical is likely to increase breast cancer risk. So what we did is we compared the proportion of mammary carcinogens with these activities to the proportion of chemicals that were tested for their ability to cause cancer and did not induce mammary tumors. And we found consistently that chemicals that do induce mammary tumors in rodents are more likely to have these endocrine disrupting and DNA damaging activities compared to chemicals that don't induce mammary tumors. Click. We also were able to sort of rank our chemicals according to their magnitude of effect in these endocrine-related assays. So basically, how strongly endocrine disrupting were they when they were tested in these cell-based assays? And we found that stronger endocrine disruptors are particularly more likely to be able to induce mammary tumors in rodents. Click. So we consider these chemicals with the more solid evidence for an ability to disrupt endocrine signaling as being EDC positive, meaning that they have really solid evidence that they're able to disrupt endocrine signaling. We are less confident that chemicals with borderline activities in these cell-based assays would be able to disrupt endocrine signaling in a way that would increase breast cancer risk in humans. That doesn't mean that they're not potential breast carcinogens. It just means that we have lower confidence that they are likely to be able to do that. Click. Now, since we also included information about genotoxicity or the ability to damage DNA into our study, We further found that chemicals that are stronger endocrine disruptors and genotoxic were particularly likely to be able to induce mammary tumors in rodents. This shows us even more clearly the importance of this stronger endocrine disrupting activity and the intersection of DNA damage and endocrine signaling together. Click. Now, although not that many chemicals that are non-genotoxic have actually been tested for their ability to cause cancer, we did still find that chemicals that are neither endocrine disrupting nor genotoxic were significantly less likely to be able to induce mammary tumors, which further supports our hypothesis that these endocrine disruptors that are also genotoxic are particularly likely to be potential breast cancer risk factors. So when Rashmi takes over this presentation now, we're going to focus on the chemicals that we think have the most solid evidence for their likelihood of increasing breast cancer risk in humans. And those chemicals are the mammary carcinogens, because these chemicals have already been shown to be able to cause mammary tumors in mammals that have similar biology to humans, and thus gives us a basis for extrapolation to breast cancer risk in humans. We're also highlighting chemicals that are both genotoxic and higher confidence endocrine disruptors, because these chemicals have a combination of activities that increase breast cancer risk. So these are the chemicals that were most likely to induce mammary tumors in rodents, which gives us another basis for extrapolation to humans, even if they haven't actually been tested for their ability to cause cancer before. All right, and now back to you, Rashmi.
Thank you, Jenny. All right, so if we want to look at potential risk carcinogens in plastics, first we need to know what those plastic chemicals are. So what I'm going to do is introduce the PlastChem database. The PlastChem database classifies and prioritizes plastic chemicals. It's an effort led by Martin Wagner at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and they were able to find over 16,000 chemicals in plastics for various reasons, either as initial material or as additives or contaminants, etc. With those 16,000 chemicals, they then went to group them. In order to group them, they looked for existing lists. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency has a tool called the ComTox dashboard, which has lists of different groupings of chemicals, and the European Chemicals Agency and other counterparts have similar. They also use keyword searching, which just refers to looking at the name of the chemical for information about it, because the way we name chemicals tells us a lot about how they might be grouped or what their makeup is like. And with that, they're able to classify into these groups that are called structural groups. To take an example, let's just take BPA. BPA, or you may know it as bisphenol A, is a pretty famous chemical. And if I look at it, I know that it says bisphenol in its name, so I might correctly assume that I should call that a bisphenol. And then if I look on the ComTox dashboard for a list of bisphenols, BPA is indeed on it. And since those things agree, it's pretty simple to classify BPA as a bisphenol. Doing that for 16,000 chemicals is a lot more work, but this database does that for us. Then from these structural groups, they looked at hazard information for each of the chemicals within those groups. Using 15 different authoritative databases, they looked to see if the chemicals were carcinogens, whether they were mutagens, reproductive toxicants, endocrine disruptors, anything like that. And they added all of that hazard information to their database and were able to score the structural groups themselves. These scores just refer to the percent of the chemicals within the group that are considered hazardous. With these different hazardous percents, then I should mention, bisphenols are like about 60% of the chemicals within bisphenols are considered hazardous, if you want a concrete example of what that hazardous percent means. But from there, using those different hazard percents, they're able to prioritize the groups into 15 specific priority groups of concern. Bisphenols do make it on here because the cutoff they defined was 40%. And these other 14 groups are here too. I've bolded all of the ones that we also find in the potential breast carcinogens and plastics list. So that's most of these different chemicals. And I want to take a second to give you specific chemical examples from these groups. So if we just look at aromatic amines, CI dispersed black 6 and 4-biphenylamine are two particular examples. Aromatic amines are interesting as a group because 100% of the chemicals that PlastChem categorized for aromatic amines are actually hazardous. Then for parabens, two good examples are ethylparaben and propylparaben. Parabens are typically preservatives, so you will find these in food as a preservative or perhaps in cosmetics for similar reasons. Then there are azodyes, which two examples are azobenzene and CI acid red 114. So these guys are dyes that might be used to dye plastics. And then for bisphenols, we have bisphenol A, B, and AF. Bisphenol A we've mentioned, it's a pretty famous hazardous chemical, and bisphenol B is often used as a substitute for it in the many uses it has across plastics. Then phthalates, a good example is diethylhexyl phthalate, or DEHP. All of that to say, starting from individual chemicals, we're able to get to structural groups and then to 15 groups to prioritize, thanks to the PlastChem database. Structural groups might be one way to prioritize chemicals, and another is by regulation status. PlastChem has 6 different lists based on the hazard of a chemical and its current regulation status. So 2 specific lists that they have are the gray list and the meal list. They set both of these aside as not really possible to regulate. The gray list is those that do not have any hazard classification information and therefore are difficult to convince regulators to do anything about these. Then there's the MIA list, which is the multilateral environmental agreement list. This just refers to those chemicals that do have hazardous information and that have been regulated for globally. Then there's those that are hazardous but don't have good information or don't have good regulation set up yet. This includes the red list, which is chemicals they're the most concerned about. And it has 457 known or presumed human carcinogens on it, including things like styrene, which you may have heard of, and many with additional hazards. Then less hazardous chemicals are sorted into the orange list of about 1,000 chemicals, and those under assessment go on the watch list. That is very few in the grand scheme of the database. Chemicals that are in theory not hazardous go on the white list. However, I have a note about that for you. Only one chemical actually has full hazard testing data. If we recall the previous list, or the previous slide, we talked about how they might check for carcinogenicity or endocrine disruption or various different things, but all of those things take some time to test and some money, and so pretty much no chemical actually has the full data there. So even these whitelist chemicals that we consider not hazardous, none of them actually have full hazard testing data. Take that as you will. In summary, these are the ones we want to pay attention to. Got the MIA list for chemicals that are regulated, the gray list for chemicals that we don't have data about, the orange list for the in-between chemicals, and the red list specifically has those chemicals that are both hazardous and not regulated, and that's the thing I just want you to remember for the next couple of slides. Now that we've looked at the way PlastChem categorizes plastic chemicals, we can explore the plastic chemicals that are actually potential breast carcinogens. There are 414 of those chemicals. So we're going to look at all this data together from these 2 different databases, or these 2 different lists, but I will put up this key just so you can recall what we just talked about. The y-axis has all these PlastChem hazardous regulatory status lists. Just remember the red list with those chemicals that are both hazardous and underregulated. Then the x-axis will deal with toxicity characteristics. Endocrine disruption, from what Jenny discussed, remember, is just hormone disruption, and genotoxicity refers to DNA damage. I will put the key away, and now we can actually look at the data. So many potential breast carcinogens in plastics are underregulated and hazardous. Let's break it down a little. There are 166 endocrine disruptors that we are pretty confident about here. There's 175 that we're a bit less confident about, but we consider both of those endocrine disrupting, so there's 341 total. That's more than 3/4 of this entire list. Then there's 309 chemicals on the red list, again, both underregulated and hazardous. There's 41 on the gray list that are endocrine disrupting. And before you complain about my circle, yes, it's circling 43, but there's 2 that are not tested, so we have to subtract those back out. So 41 is correct. And then I'm going to switch graphs. The y-axis is the exact same, but on the x-axis now is genotoxicity instead. And we can see that there's 227 genotoxic chemicals. But we're not quite done because we need to look at both genotoxicity and endocrine disruption together. As Jenny talked about, we're worried about chemicals that have both modes of harm. So we can switch to an axis that just includes both endocrine disruption and genotoxicity. And this lets us note that there's 94 genotoxic endocrine disruptors here. Also, don't look for this on the graph. 81 does not exist on the graph, but there are 81 mammary carcinogens that aren't genotoxic endocrine disruptors, and that was the other category we were using to select the ones that are the most, that have the most potential for harm. So that gives us our list of the 175 potential breast carcinogens to prioritize within plastics. Finally, I'm going to share the figure from the paper, which is not that different than all the work we just did to explore the data. The key is the exact same one we've been looking at. I'm throwing it back up so you can look at it. But the only new fact here is really that there's 88 potential breast carcinogens that belong to PlastChem priority groups. And PlastChem priority groups were those 15 groups that we went over, those like azo-dyes, the PFAS, the parabens, those kinds of things. And all we've done is add color to this graph that gives you an idea of the density of chemicals belonging to structure-based priority groups across these axes that we talked about. And I do want to talk a little about specific chemicals here. So if we look at this 80 circle over here with these 80 chemicals that are both on the red list and endocrine disrupting and genotoxic, this circle contains many pesticides such as atrazine, many different azo-dyes, DEHP phthalate, BPA, they're all in there. And if we just look down over here to the 4 gray list chemicals that are endocrine disrupting and genotoxic, that's a pretty dark circle because it's got 2 bisphenols in it. Half of that group belongs to different PlastChem structure-based priority groups. So while there are many ways to prioritize these chemicals, regardless, we need to do something about them. So we can keep the data in mind and move on to our specific asks about prioritization and regulation. We need regulation in the first place. I hope that goes without saying. And we want a binding global treaty in particular. We want it to take into account the following. First, it needs to prioritize because there's so many chemicals, and we want it to prioritize the 175 that we have with the strongest evidence of harm. Then it also needs to address data gaps. I have 3 specific notes here. One, there are big barriers in epidemiology to studying potential breast carcinogens and exposure, largely because everyone is exposed to those chemicals, and it's difficult to identify who might be more or less exposed. Without that human data, it becomes more important to keep in mind in vitro and in vivo data. And we should take endocrine disruption in cells as a warning about possible effects in humans. Then, many chemicals are lacking in data. Keep in mind that 10,000 of those 16,000 chemicals, roughly, that were in the PlastChem database had no hazard data whatsoever. We can actually fix that to some extent by integrating more types of data. For example, we were able to see that 41 potential breast carcinogens are on the gray list by keeping in mind some more high throughput data. Then finally, there's a problem with generally taking slow action and regrettable substitutions. Think back to that BPA example where BPA is being replaced with bisphenol B, except they're both actually pretty high confidence endocrine disruptors. So we want to take a more cautious approach using structural similarities. The PlastChem database prioritizes any structural group that contains more than 40% hazardous chemicals. And approaches like this are very important when there's so many chemicals that need to be tested and that we're going to be continued to be exposed to as they're doing that. So regulators must act fast and protect the public from the most dangerous chemicals. So prioritization and approaches for data for chemicals are going to be especially important. Now that I've covered what we can do about those problems, it is time to wrap up. So breast cancer is on the rise, and chemical exposures likely play a role. We've identified the 414 potential breast carcinogens in plastics. 175 are the highest priority for breast carcinogenic biological activity, and 88 are in hazardous structural group prioritized by the PlastChem project. We need to take efficient and cautious approaches to reduction. We need to act on the available data to prevent harm, even if it's not clearly shown in humans. We need to regulate chemicals as groups, not simply one by one. And overall, the most important takeaway is that reducing exposures to chemicals and plastics can likely reduce breast cancer risk. Before we move to questions, I just want to take a second to thank everyone who made this work possible. Research is a huge team effort. I especially want to thank the other 5 co-authors on this paper. All of us actually do happen to be from Silent Spring Institute, which is a really incredible team that cares deeply about this work. Our donors are also super important to being able to do it at all. And yeah, overall, we're just happy to take questions at any time. Feel free to get in touch with us. And I think I should hand this back to Sarah in order to take the questions, or?
Yes, thank you, Rashmi, and thank you, Jenny. That was great, and thank you so much for walking us through that study. Yeah, and we can move into questions now. We already have a few from the audience, but if you haven't sent in your questions, now's the time to do that. Maybe
Okay, 1 second. I need a charger because that is the most predictable thing on earth.
of course. Okay, maybe we can start with the first question. So it's on expanded polystyrene foam, and they're wondering, do you have any recommendations for research specifically looking at EPS and associated chemicals such as styrene in breast cancer and other health harms?
Yeah, this is a great question. And so one thing that I can say is that styrene is on our list of potential breast carcinogens because it is a rodent mammary carcinogen. Now, what's tricky about styrene is that it's very volatile, so it's hard to
Sorry
test
about
in
that.
cell-based assays. That's okay. I was just answering a question in the Q&A about chemicals in expanded polystyrene. Styrene does induce mammary tumors in rodents, but it's very difficult to test in cell-based assays because it's hard to get it to dissolve into solutions. It's also difficult to study epidemiologically for breast cancer risk because most the sort of highest quality epidemiology studies come from occupational exposures, and historically, women and people with breasts are less likely to work in the industries that produce polystyrene. Now, expanding epidemiology to the general population is challenging also, as Rashmi was alluding to, because when it comes to plastics, none of us are not exposed anymore, right? Like we all are exposed to plastics in our everyday lives. So it's very difficult to come up with individual comparison groups that would allow us to say, yes, styrene is increasing breast cancer risk. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not increasing breast cancer risk. We do have evidence that it can cause mammary tumors in rodents, but tying styrene in particular to breast cancer risk in humans has proven to be a little bit more challenging. So as far as recommendations for research, I would say, trying to seek out epidemiological studies or promote epidemiological studies that haven't been done yet that would look at styrene exposure in women and people with breasts would be one way of trying to get more solid evidence that styrene and other chemicals in expanded polystyrene are increasing breast cancer risk. But styrene itself has also been classified by the National Toxicology Program in the US as reasonably anticipated to be a carcinogen in humans, just not specifically for breast cancer.
Thank you for that. We have a lot of questions, so for our speakers, if you see a particularly good one that you'd like to answer, feel free to jump in with that. But maybe we can go to the next one. Is there any connection between specific chemical that causes metaplastic breast cancer?
I have not seen research that specifically looks for chemicals that influence the progression from non-malignant breast cancer to metastatic breast cancer. I think that that is one area of research that would be useful to sort of expand upon.
Thank you. So you talked about international regulation with the Global Plastics Treaty. Um, is there any, I see a question about, is there any legislation on the state or national level that we could follow that's going on?
Yes, there are some states that are working to regulate plastics. Um, I think that so there is an organization called Safer States that has information about states that are taking specific actions to regulate harmful chemicals and plastics. The ones that I'm aware of are for PFAS and phthalates. I think there are about 24 states that are considering legislation for chemicals and plastics. There are also advocacy groups that are dedicated to transitioning beyond plastics. In fact, one of those groups is called Beyond Plastics, if you want to look them up.
Thank you. How about this question from Paula? Are there any efforts to connect plastics and cancer in humans, such as testing the levels of plastic in women who are diagnosed with breast cancer?
I think that there are efforts to connect plastics and cancer in humans. Um, I am not, following, I'm not up on exactly who is doing what types of studies with plastic chemicals and cancer risk in humans. But I know that plastics are a big concern that where people are trying to draw more solid links between levels of plastics in humans and disease risks, including breast cancer. The challenge, of course, is finding a good comparison group of people who are exposed to people who have lower levels of exposure.
And I see one question from Kashyap. What are the major chemicals of concern in plastics causing breast cancer risk at workplaces?
Let's see, for chemicals in workplaces in plastics that cause breast cancer, I think, well, I saw there was one note in the question and answer about women working in retail and handling receipts very often. Um, I don't know to answer that question in the Q&A. I don't know if people have actually done epidemiological studies looking at health risks in cashiers, for example. But I know that exposure to chemicals through receipts, which I learned in a webinar, I think last year, and was very interested to learn that the level of bisphenols that are allowed to be in those thermal paper receipts are based on an assumption that people will only be in contact with them for 5 seconds, which of course for cashiers is very far from their daily realities. So I think that that is a very real occupational exposure concern for them. Every industry will have different types of chemicals of concern. I think that the chemicals that are sort of less commonly thought about as being in plastics are one area that I am particularly interested in and concerned about because they're sort of flying under the radar. Um, so, uh, yeah, I think, in terms of occupational exposures, anything where There's a high risk of inhaling chemicals in plastics or, chemicals that are being released from plastics would be particularly concerning.
Mhm. I see another person mentioned that they're a hairdresser, so possibly exposure through chemicals in the products.
Yeah, it is, possible to be exposed to chemicals through, hair salon products, certainly. Um, some of those chemicals, like I just mentioned, are volatile, which means that they get released into the air for inhalation exposure risk. Um, I know that there are some epidemiological studies looking at breast cancer risk in salon workers, although, and chemical exposures in salon workers. We have some work related to that going on right now. A colleague of ours named Jenny O'Hagan is doing some work looking at occupations where immigrant women are being exposed to chemicals in their workplaces, and salons are definitely one of the ones that we are paying attention to.
And then I received a question by email that is asking about what can individuals do within a community to make other residents aware of possible dangers posed by plastics and chemicals in the environment.
Sorry, could you say that one more time?
Yes, this is a tougher one, talking about what individuals can do within their communities. So they just asked about what can people do to make other residents aware of possible dangers posed by plastics and chemicals in the environment.
Yeah, I mean, individual action, I think, can take many forms. You can, talk to your friends. You can bring up concerns about plastics at, for example, local government meetings, your town council, engaging with legislators at the state, local, or national level, are all ways to try to, raise awareness not just with the people who make regulatory decisions, but also with everyone else who attends those sessions, will hear your concerns about plastics and then may be, motivated to do something as well. Their Silent Spring also makes an app called Detox Me, where we give lots of different tips for ways that you can reduce your plastic exposures. So for example, trying not to store or heat food in plastics is one great way to reduce your exposure to chemicals and plastics. Um, so, learning for yourself about ways that you can avoid chemicals of concern, and then passing that information along to your friends, also sharing that with them, tips that you learn and also resources that you may find for reducing exposures, are sort of different ways of getting at this issue of our, massive exposure to chemicals of concern. Um, both for yourself, for your friends, and for regulators who can protect your community.
Thank you. Um, I know, Rashmi, you talked about how there's a lot of gaps in information and data on hazard data for a lot of chemicals. Um, is there a reason why there's not a lot of data on so many chemicals, and are there efforts to address these gaps in the data?
Yeah, so many chemicals probably should be tested, but it takes a lot of time and money to do so. Sometimes quite prohibitively so, and sometimes I mean, it depends how much of an allocation of resources they want to do for these specific issues, but Jenny, do you know if there's specific like efforts to address plastic chemical gaps?
Um, to address sort of hazard testing for chemicals and plastics, I don't know of specific coordinated large-scale efforts to fill those data gaps. Organizations like the EPA are doing some degree of chemical screening for different types of hazards. There are, of course, other agencies in other countries who are also assessing chemicals for biological hazards. Um, I hope that, these countries will work together and share their information to sort of help fill in data gaps on on chemicals that don't have so much hazard data.
This is also why prioritization becomes so important because it's going to take a long time, even if they test everything. And honestly, logistically, they probably can't test every single thing. So that's why we want to prioritize into different groups of similar structures and things, so we can kind of take away some of the burden from having to test every specific thing.
Thank you. How about this question at the top? Are there any mechanisms or pathways that are relevant to human breast cancer development that are not observed in rodents? So they're wondering about any gaps when extrapolating the data from rodents to humans.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are certainly differences between humans and rodents. Um, and, there's sort of nuances of endocrine signaling pathways where, things might work one way in a human and slightly differently in a rodent. So there are certainly various types of nuances and differences, but the major pathways underlying breast cancer in humans and mammary tumors in rodents are, as far as we know, fairly well conserved, meaning that, chemicals that increase hormone signaling in rodents are, have evidence of being able to induce mammary tumors in rodents, as well as being able to induce breast cancer in humans. Chemicals that cause inflammation inflammation is also a mechanism that is associated with breast cancer risk in humans and in animals. So overall, like the types of activities that you see causing mammary tumors in animals are also the types of activities that cause breast cancer in humans, although sort of the finer scale details of what exactly happens in a rodent or human body may be different.
I see a question about triple negative breast cancer. Would you like to address that one? How findings relate to that?
Sure, yeah. So triple negative breast cancer is an interesting subtype of breast cancer that, since it's not as common as other types of breast cancer, but it is much more deadly, um, the, sort of underlying factors regarding chemical exposures leading to those particular types of tumors, the evidence is still emerging. Um, Something that I have sort of been getting a sense of as I read and become more immersed in the literature is that it does seem like there are a lot of chemicals that disrupt endocrine signaling being associated with triple negative breast cancer or cell-based assays looking for sort of different features that you would see in triple negative breast cancer. So even though those triple negative breast tumors do not express the estrogen and progesterone receptors, I hypothesize, and have not dug into this myself in detail, But it does seem to me that chemicals that disrupt endocrine signaling are starting to be associated with triple negative breast cancer risk, even though those tumors don't express those hormone receptors.
Mhm. Feel free to pick out any questions here that you'd like to highlight. I see lots of questions about um, certain chemicals that we as individuals can avoid, any specific chemicals to look out for in products.
Yeah, I mean, as far as plastics go, I think avoiding plastics when possible is a great step that you can take, as we just discussed, especially as Rashmi laid out so clearly for us. Plastics contain a lot of chemicals. Many of them are hazardous. So any steps you can take to avoid exposing yourself to plastics is a great step. Um, Beyond that, reading ingredient labels, both on food and on consumer products like personal care products can also be a good way to help reduce your personal exposures. Eating organic food, of course, will help to protect you from pesticide exposures. So that is, a great way to help reduce your exposures and to promote, farming practices that are less harmful for the people who are working on those farms and reduce the potential for pesticides on farmlands to leak out into the rest of the environment that the rest of us enjoy. So I think, eating organic food, avoiding food that is packaged in plastic, um, looking for personal care products that do not contain terms like parabens or fragrance on their ingredient labels can also be good ways to reduce your exposure to individual chemicals. And again, our Detox Me app, available through Silent Spring, can also give more tips for reducing your individual exposures.
Mhm. Thank you for that. I'll also share that ACAT has the breast cancer prevention toolkit, which I'll drop in the chat. And we're also involved in plastics treaty negotiations. So I just dropped the link in the chat to that. Um, but it looks like we're near the hour, so we'll take maybe one more question, one or two more questions.
Sure. I'm just looking back at the list here. Um, and I know that there are some current concerns about pesticides that I saw mentioned. So pesticides are, I think I saw one person asking for some names of particular pesticides. And there are quite a few. There are hundreds that are approved for use in the US. Um, and so, which pesticides you might be exposed to probably has to do with what your community is using. For example, if you live in a rural community, then you're more likely to be exposed to pesticides used on crops. Whereas if you are in more of a suburban community, then you might be exposed to the pesticides that are used to control weeds in parks, for example. So the types of pesticides that you're being exposed to can vary on where you live and what types of environments you're in. The pesticides and plastics are an interesting case. So this is, like Rashmi was saying earlier, likely occurring because, for example, pesticides are probably not so commonly added intentionally to plastics, but in the recycling process, things that were containing pesticides can then get mixed in with the plastic that goes through the recycling process and then end up in the new plastics that are produced, which is another reason why it's so important to reduce your use of plastics, because you don't know what all chemicals might be contaminating that plastic. It's not necessarily just sort of the raw materials that came from the feedstock, but also other stuff that may have gotten mixed into the recycling stream.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Since we're at the hour, I think that's all the questions we have time for today. So thank you all for sending in your questions, and thank you so much to our speakers for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and your insights. And I'll also say that a recording of this webinar will be available on our website in the next day or two, and it'll also be sent to your emails. So thank you all, and we'll see you next time.